Okay, we are officially live. Okay, Hannah Davis here. You guys watching know that. I am joined by someone I'm so excited to speak with, Rochelle Riley, Pulitzer Prize winning columnist, writer, now in charge of the arts in the city of Detroit. The publications that you've worked for, the issues that you've covered, it blows my mind. If you can you give our viewers a brief description of your life and work?
I am a North Carolina girl with city roots. My parents split up, and my father was in New York, and my mom was in North Carolina. I went to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where I majored in journalism and white people. And then I worked at the Greensboro paper, the Dallas paper, the Louisville, Kentucky paper, and then the Detroit Free Press, where for almost 20 years I was a newspaper columnist covering race, government accountability, kids, and anything else I wanted.
What year was that when you were starting your columnist work?
Well, I actually started at the Courier-Journal in Louisville, Kentucky, and my very first column was about Muhammad Ali, where I took the whole city to task for there not being a museum or something there to honor him, considering he's the most famous man in the world. And I'll never forget, I turned in that column, my very first column, debut column, and the editor said, you're telling people they should be ashamed of themselves, but you've got all these rich people in here. Do you know them? And I said, no, but everybody knows they're rich. And the mayor read it and said, you're right, we should be ashamed of ourselves, and we're going to start doing something. And eventually the city raised $80 million to build the Muhammad Ali Center on the banks of the Ohio River.
I want to talk about ruffling feathers, especially as a young, ambitious woman and Black woman in the journalism profession. Before I do that, you had said something. What did you say you majored in at university?
I majored in journalism and white people.
All right, explain that for me.
Well, everybody in my family went to an HBCU proudly, and I would have too, except I wanted the best journalism program in the state. And also, if I wanted to navigate newsrooms, whether they were television or newspaper, I'd have to understand how to manage up, down, and sideways the people who were in charge. And the people in charge of our media forever have been white Americans. Some of them a little more astute and aware of the way life is than others, but almost all of them men. And I learned well, and it has served me well.
Did you always look at it as a deliberate, conscious study? You were aware of that difference and that you had to look at it as there were lessons to be learned here? Or is that something was that a perspective that you gained over time?
That's something I knew was necessary from the time I was in high school. I was one of the kids who excelled, and I excelled a lot and did everything because mostly I wanted to get out of the small town that I was growing up in. And second, because I knew what was necessary to do it. I was always aware of having to have a foot in two worlds to be successful and to also be unapologetically Black. The latter was harder when I was younger, not hard at all now. But yes, it was a conscious effort to make sure that I paid attention to who was in the room and what was necessary to make them see me for who I was, but to also make sure they understood where I came from. And you can't necessarily go into a room and do what I did as a columnist, which of course was later in life. And my editor used to tell people, this is just in the past couple of years, yeah, Rochelle is the one who'll go and throw a grenade in a room. That's not something you can do when you're younger. What you do is you try to find a way to have the conversations that you otherwise might not be able to have. But it's a double, every African American I know who's successful has always had two jobs, the job and the job of doing the job.
For people who haven't lived that experience or maybe are struggling to understand what you're saying, can you think of an anecdote or for instance where you looked at a situation like a case study and took that information and then navigated it to achieve the goals that you wanted to?
Well, they live it whether they know it or not. So I'll give you two examples. When I was a manager in Louisville, and they had just hired somebody for a job. The person was African American. I'll never forget the publisher said, yeah, I really like him. He's so smart. And I thought, well, what an interesting thing to say about somebody who obviously would have to be for this job. But I didn't say anything. Well, literally, it was just like a couple of months later. It wasn't that long. They hired a new white editor. And I'm standing there with the publisher who's beaming because he's really proud of the hire he made. And I said, oh, yeah, he's so smart. He went, well, of course he's smart. And I thought, isn't that interesting that that's an expectation and you're surprised that it would come up? But remember the other smart guy? And then there was another time where the one of the editors every year would take out his team. I was the deputy managing editor and he was the managing editor, and he would take out his team for this Christmas lunch. It was like a celebration, you know. This is Louisville, Kentucky. This is very highbrow restaurant. And so people started talking about their past and where they came from and how they, you know, could trace their family back to the Mayflower or back to some German family. And I said, well, as far as I was able to get was a slave named Balaam that I found in the tax records of an attorney in North Carolina. And the whole table went white. Well, really went white. And there was this total discomfort. And later he said, why did you do that? And I said, what? I thought we were sharing our history. So there are moments where you can remind people that the world they're living in is not necessarily the total known world. And to be aware of that all the time, you know, is just a part of who we are. And those who aren't, eventually they will be.
Yeah, I love that you bring that up. That was one of the things that stuck out to me. For those of you that don't know, Rochelle, Lord knows how many words you've written over your career, but this book, The Burden, African Americans and the Enduring Impact of Slavery, which is I'm trying to show it, a collection of essays and reflections on the role of race in the enduring legacy of slavery. It's a beautiful book. But one of the things that you brought up was this quote from Booker T. Washington, and it was in reference to your own search for your own family's history. And are you able to see the quote that's on the screen?
I am, yes. It's one of my favorites.
Would you mind reading it for us?
Not at all. I'm not quite sure of the exact place or exact date of my birth, but at any rate, I suspect that I must have been born somewhere and at some time. That's something that's, I don't have to tell you, that if you're African American and descended from the enslaved, that you live with all the time, that you don't know.
I think people take that for granted. I mean, even on a smaller scale, when you talk to a child who's been adopted, it's that desire to know, where do I come from? It's, I think we're born with that.
I think it's the way that we teach history in America. First of all, we don't teach all of it, which is why our kids become so ignorant of each other's past. If we actually taught all of American history and all of the amazing magicalness of Black folks, then you wouldn't have little Black children thinking that all they are descendants of the enslaved. And you wouldn't have white children thinking that all Black children are the descendants of the enslaved. I think that we have set that system up to ensure that there's always a first class and always a second class, and never the twain shall meet. So we start with colonization and just move forward. I think it's a shame because, for instance, you know, to hear the President of the United States say that he introduced Juneteenth to America because he didn't know what it was, or that people literally were surprised when Michelle Obama said at the DNC a few years ago that the enslaved built the White House, as if they thought George Washington got out there with an axe and did it. People just don't know. And if there's anything that's going to come out of the legacy of the murder of George Floyd more than anything at all, it's this realization that people have been ignoring the trauma and the brutality for that long. It's like, oh my God, now they see us.
Do you have, the title of your book is The Burden, and you talk about the need to, we have not put that burden, the weight of it down yet.
Right.
What is, and this is the $64,000 question, what are the steps that we take now to start to do that?
Well, can I read a paragraph?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
So I won't read the whole thing, but what I do is recall a scene from The Shawshank Redemption where Red, brilliantly played by Morgan Freeman, was working as a bag boy in a grocer and had to go to the bathroom. And he raised his hand and asked his white supervisor if he could go. And the guy is like really not happy. And he said, you don't need to ask me every time you need to take a piss. Just go, understand? And Red nods and goes to the men's room. But in voiceover, he says, 40 years I've been asking permission to piss. I can't squeeze a drop without say so. That's what prison did to a grown man in a fictional film, The Shawshank Redemption. That is what being enslaved did to a people. And while people focus on the physical brutality of slavery, what they need to focus on is the emotional brutality, that burden. And it's embodied in one word: permission. To speak, permission to vote, permission to work in jobs that allow us to use all of our talents, permission to drink from community water fountains, permission to dine at public lunch counters, permission to sit anywhere on public buses that our tax dollars pay for, permission to provide our children with educations equal to those of their white peers, permission to embrace the freedom the Emancipation Proclamation lied about, permission to run for the presidency of the United States of America. We African Americans in the United States have spent a century and a half seeking permission, hiding our lights under bushels, accepting less than we deserve because we've been trained to believe we don't deserve more. It's time to put that burden down. That's a major burden, and we have to stop carrying it.
How do you begin to put that burden down? It is so large. There's so much history to it. In some ways, it's subconscious. How do you begin to dismantle that burden and put it down piece by piece?
The first thing you have to do is stop assuming that it's gone, or hoping that it's gone, or trying to pretend if you ignore it, it will go away. Yeah. And then you have to look at all the different ways it has affected the lives of Black people, which come to the fore every time there's an emergency. The health crisis with African Americans has gone on literally since slavery, but nobody has done anything about it. Nobody has talked about it. Nobody has said we must do something about it, until now all of a sudden COVID-19 reveals that, oh my goodness, Black people are dying more because they're more vulnerable. Well, we've always been more vulnerable because there's no health care and because of the way we were forced to eat. And, you start to look at those things. But the very first thing that has to be done is education. I have made longtime civil rights judges very angry by saying I thought the Brown versus Board of Education decision was wrong. Thurgood Marshall was a brilliant attorney who changed America more than any other attorney, argued more cases before the Supreme Court than any other attorney. But fighting for equal education did not mean putting a child in a school with white kids if the white kids would still have more resources, if they'd still have better teachers, if they still had a weighted system of assessing their growth, so that no matter what, you still have Black kids who are behind. So the first thing that has to be done is equal education, so that we can stop blaming kids who didn't get educated for not having jobs later in life. If we start there, that will take care of a lot of it. But then the second thing is also not presuming that things will change on their own. If we don't have a conversation we've never had, we're not going to talk about what needs to be fixed. So if you know there are health disparities, you need to focus on that. If we know that there are legal disparities, every day there's a case with somebody spending decades in jail who wasn't supposed to be there, and they get out and people are excited. And I'm like, that's why I don't celebrate Juneteenth, or at least I didn't until today. Because why am I excited that some of the enslaved found out 2 years late that they were, they were free and weren't supposed to still be enslaved? But then I said, no, if I look at it as the legal end of the old slavery, we can celebrate that while we continue to fight for the end of real slavery, which still exists without law.
You and I spoke over the phone before we set up this interview, and even when we were speaking on the phone, I was so excited to speak with you, because I think conversations, in-depth, nuanced, honest conversations are one of the most healing. As journalists, I think we believe this.
Yeah.
I think race may be the most difficult thing to speak about, at least for white people. I think it is. Why is it so difficult? And do you have advice for people as we go through? It's an emotional moment. It's a painful moment. It's a moment of reckoning. Do you have advice on navigating these needed conversations so we do have progress?
Let me tell you, when Nikole Hannah-Jones, my friend Nikole Hannah-Jones, wrote the foreword for The Burden, she said, "We remain a nation of full citizens and part citizens, and our original sin remains the thing for which we, the people the sin was visited upon, can never be forgiven. Our very presence here reminds this great nation of all that it is not." The reason it's so hard is because to acknowledge and accept that, yes, this happened, yes, America did this, not some individual white person, Pete Sims over here, or Joe Banks over here, they didn't do this, America did this. So I don't want to hear another person say, well, I didn't own slaves and that was a long time ago. It is not your personal debt. It is America's debt. It is America's problem. And until we acknowledge it, we're never going to solve it. But by acknowledging it, we have to admit that we allowed this to happen. We allowed all of it to happen. Centuries of slavery, another 50 years of lynching, another 50 years of Jim Crow laws, actual legal laws that said Black people couldn't drink from the same water fountain or sit in the same places or eat in the same restaurants. This entire demonization and brutal treatment of a whole people. And now we want to pretend like because Oprah Winfrey is rich or there's some baseball players that, well, you guys can make it, if they can do it. This guy literally said, well, Will Smith is a star. And I'm like, and what does that have to do with 10 kids in this school district who literally had to sue the state of Michigan to say they had the right to literacy? I'm sorry, but none of that makes sense. And you cannot escape this by trying to pretend like it didn't happen or that America wasn't at fault.
That I listened to an interview with the historian John Meacham, and he was talking about the Thomas Jeffersons, the leaders that we look back on now and say, oh, there's some problems here. But what he said, and I thought this was such a good point, was that to vilify them and to kick them out is taking us all off the hook, because what they represented, they weren't an aberration. They represented the majority, the thought of the nation at that time. So to cast them out, we're not really reckoning with it. We're not really looking at how the majority of society was set up at that time. And when he put it up that way, that was an aha moment for me.
He's exactly right. And he's one of my favorite historians because unlike Doris Kearns Goodwin, I don't know that he has actually plagiarized or made anything up. But this is the most important thing, and this is what people don't understand. These were the Mitch McConnells and the Ted Cruzes and some of the good guys too, who literally were just people in government. Thomas Jefferson wrote a clause ending slavery, saying that, okay, if I'm writing all men are created equal, all men have to be created, and they took it out and said, you can't, come on, man, you can't put that in there. So even though he owned slaves and even though he knew what the times were, he at least knew that the words he was writing were false. So this is what happens now with white nationalists and with racists. If you can put the problem on them and say, oh, well, it's not me, Donald Trump is a racist on his own and he doesn't represent everybody. If he is the leader of your party and he's doing that, he does speak for you, he does represent you, and you cannot hide from that. You cannot pretend like, let's just blame those people and you go be mad at them, because everything that is allowed by those folks who Martin Luther King used to say were the white progressives who sat by and didn't do enough. If you're our friends, if you're the people who really see that this is wrong, you cannot sit by and pretend like, well, since I don't feel that way, I'm not a part of the problem. If you're doing nothing, you're a part of the problem.
Rochelle, that's one of the things that I continue to hear in this moment is that the reason for hope is that people see more white people, more people that don't look like you out in the protest and speaking out. That's a moment that they see a bit of a turning point. Do you see that? And I'm not saying it's all said and done. Do you see that when you hear people say that? What's your reaction?
Well, I had two reactions. The first one was positive. This is not a moment. This is a movement. This is unprecedented. People are literally marching around the world. But the thing that gave me hope is that a lot of the people were young people. They were people who thought that this idea, this crazy myth of a post-racial society was something that was actually true when it was really silly, who really thought that things were better than they thought it was, who said, oh, we don't have to deal with racism. My friends and I, we don't have that problem. And now they are seeing that, oh my God, we do have that problem. This is the society we're living in. It's going to be up to them to fix it, because there are some racists that you're not going to change who they are. They have to die out. And you have to make sure that the next group of people who will lead us away from what everybody thought was okay before. That means there must be racial intolerance in act and not racial intolerance in words. I don't care if you stand up and give a speech or if you go on Twitter and say something that you think is meaningful. Like Leah Michelle found out when she was talking about, oh, Black Lives Matter, and then all of her co-stars say, you treated Black and brown people on your show like crap. You have to live it. You have to live it. And if you're not able to feel it because you're not that color, then you have to listen to the people who are. Nothing makes me angrier than somebody who says, I absolutely see what you're talking about, and we need to let you be able to say that. And I'm like, no, you need to say it. Letting me say I'm in pain means nothing. If you say stop hurting that person, that means something. So anybody who's standing by and saying nice things. I want them to just go in their house and be quiet.
I took a course on Holocaust history, and one of the things that they focused on was the bystanders,
Yes.
the people that didn't speak up. And the lesson was, and I think they called it to be an upstander, that when you see something, you speak out if you are a person, whoever you are, but especially if you're not somebody being directly impacted by it. Rochelle, there you are. You cut out for a second. The fact of the matter is,
there I am.
I've got you now. The fact of the matter is, this is difficult. It's difficult for a lot of people to speak about. And I think white people become defensive. They become defensive. And I think when that starts, people start shutting down and blocking off. Do you, I almost feel bad asking you. You cut out. I'm going to wait for you to pop back up.
Sorry, I'm coming.
It's okay. It's
my
okay.
Phone was there. I'm sorry, my phone was ringing. You can't put the phone on airplane mode, or I won't be able to talk to you.
That's okay. I know you're in high demand. But my question is, and I feel bad almost asking you this, what is your advice for white people or any people when they start to become defensive? When you're asking a subgroup to look within themselves and to look at the dirt and to acknowledge and start to clean house. The reaction can be knee-jerk, defensive, don't want to go there.
Well, the first thing I do is I don't deal with strangers. I talk to people who genuinely seem to care or cared before this. I mean, there's the racial pandemic and there's the COVID-19 pandemic. I don't want you to just wear a mask. I want you to not let anybody else put on a hood. And if you're not somebody who feels like you can stand up and do, that's fine, but don't expect me to look at you the same way. Just like I treat anybody who's not wearing a mask like they smell or like they have cooties. I don't allow people in my life who think it's okay for racism to happen because they're not really doing it. If you're not racist to me, that's fine. But if you watch somebody who's being racist and you just say, well, that's a part of life, that's not a part of my life. I want people in my world who absolutely want to stand up against this and do something about it, in how they vote, in how they speak, and in what they tolerate. And for those, all you have to do is listen. You don't have to make speeches. You don't have to go and study anything. I have all these folks who now want to study Black history and all these things that they didn't know about. Where can I find information about Juneteenth? Well, it's called the Google. Go and look up whatever you need to know and understand. And I'm happy to talk to you about it, but don't be blissful in your ignorance. Don't act like because you never knew and you're just hearing stuff and it's like, oh, but I didn't know that. Yeah, but you got until Saturday to let's look up some stuff and have a conversation about it if you're serious. And if you're not, that's fine. I have more time for those people who do want to have those conversations and who do want to change the way they see the world.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the first things you talked about was a column on Muhammad Ali. And what year was this written?
1996. I was a columnist in Louisville for 4 years before I came to Detroit.
1996. So
yeah, I know that's dating me. I'm younger than
Well, I think women in general struggle with this need to be liked as opposed to respected. You're going into Louisville, you're writing a controversial column that's calling people out. Are you okay with not being liked?
Never had a problem with it. My first column, Detroit Free Press, called for the schools to be shut down. It was shameful. I said, how dare you have a school district that's not educating children and you think it's okay? The thing that used to bother me here the most was every year we would write about how the Detroit kids placed last on national standardized tests. And I went, they're last again. They were last year. And now you're saying they're last again and we didn't do anything. And that went on for 8 years. It was horrible. So, yeah.
Did you have to learn that comfort with being disliked or ruffling feathers, or was that something that you were born with? And whatever the answer is, what is your advice for anyone out there? Because when you speak truth to power, you aren't always going to be liked. What is your advice for doing that?
Well, I will tell you, and I'll let that be my last comment, except to tell people to go to RochelleRiley.com to see how to buy the burden. I was an introvert. I was a very shy child who had to get over that to excel and to be in all the clubs and to be the student government president and to do all those things, because I knew that would get me out of that high school, out of that town, to the University of North Carolina, and to every place I wanted to be. Somewhere along the way, when I decided that I would speak out and that my voice had to be important, I knew that I had to be strong enough to not listen to people who would not want me to say what needed to be said. And the very first time somebody called me the N word, I had to decide whether it mattered, because it was a big deal. And then I said, it doesn't matter, because this person does not own me. This person does not affect my life. They're just some guy who disagrees with what I said. And after that, I don't have anybody who knows me saying these things. These are strangers, and them racist. Why would I care what they said? So it got to the point where I really, really didn't care. And if it was somebody important and I thought I wanted to understand why they were saying, I would call up people who called me names, and they would always be stunned. They said, oh my God, this isn't you. And I said, I'm going to hang up and go to the paper, go to the bottom of the column, call the number that's there and call me back. This woman actually apologized and said she didn't know that I read the comments at the end of my column and that I would know that she said that. And I went, I did, and I do. And why don't we go have some lunch? Because they're just stunned. They're just so surprised in their sort of mutual societies of let's go hate somebody, that they don't even see you as a person until you make them see you. So no, it never bothered me. And I stopped reading the comments eventually. And I will never stop speaking out about the things that are wrong, whether it's the Flint water crisis or how we treat our children.
Rochelle, I can't thank you enough for your time. I'm gonna put a link to your book, How to Get It, in this link on Facebook, so people can access it that way. I've truly enjoyed reading it, and I've enjoyed meeting you and having this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. You're fantastic. I love talking to you. Let's talk again.
I was gonna say this won't be the last time. This was too good.
Thanks so much, Hannah.
You're welcome. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.